With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Heard Tell show, January 11th. It's a Tuesday. I know you're excited about it. I'm Andrew Donaldson. Finally on the uptick, kind of getting the voice back, still a little grovelly. Just work with us. Appreciate it. Spent most of the last week with COVID and sickness in the house. We've tried to soldier on as best we could. We had to miss one show, unfortunately, because I just could not talk at all. But we've been trying to do our best with it, and we appreciate you sticking with us. Glad you're with us. Hope your weekend and your Monday went well. We're going to have a lot of good stuff on the show today. We're going to talk about how we discuss culture and politics like we frequently do. Very interesting piece out of the Atlantic we're going to talk about. Also going to update a couple different stories. The I-95 snowpocalypse had some good moments in humanity. We're going to talk about that later. The James Webb Space Telescope, we talked about that with our friend Michael Siegel. It had itself a good couple of days. We're going to talk about its successful deployment as well. Cooper Conway is our guest today. We're going to talk a little Elon Musk. Everybody loves to have an opinion on him, but we're going to take kind of an interesting direction on it. Cooper talks a lot about education and things like this. We're going to kind of spin it that way. Like, do we properly handle our eccentric genius inventor types the way we used to in education? And not that Elon Musk is a super great role model necessarily, but it's interesting to see how culture and education and how we view people like him as opposed to inventors of the past and captains of industry of the past. We're going to get into that with Cooper Conway. Great guy, been on the show before. Excited to talk to him again. But first, I want to start with something that frankly has greatly troubled me. We've obviously been talking about COVID-19 a lot. The news media has dominated it the last 2 years because it's dominating a lot of folks' life. Yesterday's program, we had on Morgan Stevens for basically the entire show. We were honored to do that. Listen, I got my first writing of real note, writing about myself and writing about my medical history and my issues and challenges. I know firsthand how hard it is to make yourself the subject of something that you're putting out in the public. So first of all, I just commend her courage for doing that and getting her story out. I know how hard that is. It can be cathartic. It can be therapeutic. It's also really, really hard to put yourself up for examination to the world. And we commend her for that. It's one of the highest rated episodes of Heard Tell we've done yet. And thank you all very much for watching and sharing it and listening and all those sorts of things. But while we were doing that, the rest of social media and some folks in the news media are taking a different tack. We always want to remember that every story we cover at its base is always a people story. Well, with COVID-19, we are seeing a trend, and I'm very troubled by it, and I don't like it, and we're going to address it briefly to start the program today. We're getting into this thing. Omicron has changed, as we talked with our friend Michael Siegel before on the program. It's changed how our numbers and the metrics and the statistics of COVID-19 work because it is such a contagious virus. It is rapidly spreading, but at the same time, thankfully, so far, the data looks like it's not nearly as deadly. It does not have the death toll and the hospitalization ratios with it. Now, the death toll is still way too high, and that's because people who are not vaccinated and those sorts of things, their numbers are through the roof compared to the folks that have been vaccinated. We're not here to argue all those points and rehash that again. You can find that other places. The point is in the commentary and in the discussion and on people's social media now, folks want to play this game where they take the data and either overblow it and turn it into more than it is, even although it's already tragic, or they underplay it. And now they're trying to retrograde what's going on with Omicron and apply it to the over 800,000 deaths that have already occurred over the last 2 years. Here's my issue, folks. How you treat human life in your commentary, in your social media, in your everyday conversations, how you treat human life tells me a lot more about you than what your political or ideology leanings that you're professing tell me. Human life is precious. You only get one of them. And I don't know, some of you may not realize this yet, but every single one of us is going to die. We all have an expiration date. This is just how this is. It's what makes life and the human existence unique. We get one of them and we're going to die. And we don't have a whole lot of control over it. Folks seem to be losing their humanity in the way they're dealing with COVID-19 now that it's going this route with Omicron. They want to use the numbers as political cudgels. They want to do some I told you so with some of the latest numbers. Our elected officials and our non-elected officials, folks that are appointed at places at like the CDC and stuff, have not been doing themselves any favor with their messaging and how they discuss things. We need to hold them accountable, but at the same time, just because an official messes up and says something wrong doesn't mean all your worst fears about how the COVID-19 virus has gone in the last few years may be true. We have to be so careful, and we have to maintain our bearing with things like COVID-19. Science is always evolving. It's always changing. There was a lot that we just didn't know in the beginning, and too many people were proclaiming that they did know when they didn't know. We've said over and over again on this program, one of the biggest problems with the COVID-19 crisis was a lack of humility. Government officials, experts, scientists, commentators, and us, the general public, could have all done with a big heaping helping of "I don't know" instead of making pronouncements, because now they felt like they had to either uphold those pronouncements or defend those pronouncements or make things work to keep those pronouncements to come true so that they didn't look silly. Then people started putting their politics on it. People started putting their cultural ideas on it. People started putting their personal feelings involved in it. And we had ourselves a red hot American mess on top of a disaster of hundreds of thousands of people dead, many more sick. We talked on the program yesterday with Morgan about the long COVID sufferers, otherwise perfectly healthy folks that are now having major problems that we don't fully understand and probably won't for years to come until there's proper scientific and medical study done about it. It didn't kill anybody, and nobody would have lost any social media points to have just had a little bit more humility to this thing. We're losing our humanity on these subjects because we're so busy trying to slam the square peg of whatever's going on next into the round hole of whatever was going on already in our social media feeds, in our commentary feeds, on our Facebook feeds, in our Twitter timelines. We're just so desperate to keep the conversation going the way we want it to go so that we can prove we're right, that we use every single thing that comes along as part of the fodder for it. That's not healthy, folks. It's not good. It's not good for you, your family, your community, or for the country. Now, here's how this really gets nefarious in a hurry. I understand perfectly that things like the government and people that have deigns on power can use emergencies to try to maintain that power, expand that power. We've been very vocal about that. These states of emergencies without proper recourse. People having quote unquote emergency powers. Shouldn't they have some standards as to how they do that? Those are all fine things. Those are things we've advocated for. But the reverse is true. You can't just say that something isn't a crisis when it is to suit your own very fancy. You can't just magically wave away bad things because it doesn't fit into your models of how you see the world. Again, a little humility evenly applied all around would have done everybody a world of good, might have even saved some lives. I want COVID to go away, but it wasn't. I don't want to have had COVID and been sick myself. I didn't like watching members of my household being sick with COVID. I hated having to sit and hear Morgan Stevens' story, which is representative of millions of other people who have these long haul COVID symptoms that we don't even fully understand yet. I didn't like having family members die that knowing that they died alone because they couldn't have visitors in the hospitals they were in. I didn't like having limited funerals for those family members because of COVID restrictions. There's millions and millions of stories over the last 2 years of important life events, births, weddings, deaths, funerals interrupted because of COVID. And then there's that horrific death toll of over 800,000 and counting of people who have died of this illness or connected to this illness. We can argue about the numbers, but keep all that in perspective first. These are still neighbors. These are still friends. These are still fellow countrymen. Don't let them be stats. When we make people stats and numbers, we've lost our humanity. And then what's the point of it all? We can and should do better, folks. If they're not people anymore, if they're just numbers, you've already gone to a very dark place that's going to be really hard for you to get out of. And there's no vaccine for that. More Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. I'm Andrew Donaldson. Let's talk about something we talk about on this program frequently. You know, we talk about turning down the noise of the news cycle. And one of the noisiest things in the news cycle is kind of become its own little thing. We call it Twitter ain't real life. And what we mean by that is things that are trending on social media or things that are getting really, really loud among the chattering classes. And I'm including myself in that. Doesn't mean they're actually real, as in the mass of people in the world are talking about them. We know from the data that things like, and I'll just use Twitter as an example because that's the medium I spend a lot of time working in and through and of. It's not real life. We know that there's a very small percentage of actual Americans and world citizens that's on Twitter. And then inside of that very small percentage, we know that almost 92% of all the tweets online that are shared or spread or talked about come from only about 10% of the users. It's a lot of people just saying the same thing over and over again. So Twitter definitely ain't real life, but there is some truth in there. Part of what we talk about with Twitter ain't real life, we're talking about news media ain't real life, especially broadcast network news media ain't real life, is that it always has to focus on certain things as part of their business model. And I'm not even knocking them for that. That's just the way it is. Bad news sells, as the old joke goes. Certain topics trend faster. They get more clicks. They keep people engaged. So they keep getting covered over and over and over again. That's just the way the world works. You can decry it, but it's better to just understand that that's going on and move on. There's a fascinating piece from the Atlantic back a few days ago. And again, we're working a little behind here because I spent a week dealing with COVID and sick. But Victoria Parker, writing in the Atlantic, had a very interesting piece. And this came to our attention through our Asger tweeted it. And Nicholas Grossman, a friend of the program, has been on the program before, was also tweeting about this, brought it to our attention. So that got me thinking, and I actually pulled up the article, and I think there's some interesting things in here about how what we think is true based on the news of the noise cycle or based on Twitter ain't real life or any of these other memes we talk about. There's some things in here we need to discuss. Reading from this Atlantic piece. Left-leaning readers might not be surprised that conservatives would accept as widespread a caricature of a radical liberal agenda, given that they are so clearly blinded by racism or pro-choice, pro-police sentiment that they would excuse even the most unjust excessive force. But wait, is this portrayal of conservatives accurate? No, it isn't. Just as liberals came to rally around Black Lives Matter, conservatives gravitated to Blue Lives Matter. From the vocal conservatives who made excuses for misconduct or blamed victims, some liberal commentators concluded that the right is dominated by police apologists. In fact, many on the right recognize both the humanity and hardship of police officers and those harmed by them. When we asked conservatives if police were almost always justified in the shooting of Black people, only 31% of respondents even somewhat agreed with that sentiment. Liberals, on the other hand, estimated nearly double that number, 57%, gave police a free pass. It doesn't match. Now, there's some caveats here. Our research, which is available as a preprint, is under review and subject to change. This is from the Atlantic piece, mind you. We drew our large samples of respondents from online survey platforms, not from nationally representative pollings. We recognize this is a sample, and therefore our estimates of the prevalence of liberal and conservative opinions is not an exact microcosm of the country. Still, other researchers have concluded that these platforms are reasonably comparable to national representative polling. The gap that we identified between what partisans really think and what their opponents think they think shows up again and again, but only on a particular kind of issue. People have more accurate views of the other side's position on many standard policy issues, such as taxes or healthcare, but specifically on culture war issues. Partisans are likely to believe a caricatured version of the opposing side's attitudes. These misperceptions have hardened into enduring stereotypes: liberal snowflakes and free speech police, conservative, racist, and deplorables. In reality, just a third of liberal participants agreed, even a little, with banning controversial public speakers from college campuses, but conservatives estimated that 63% of liberals held that view. Only 22% of conservatives expressed hostile and unwelcoming attitudes towards immigrants, but liberals thought that 57% of them had done so. Our data suggests that many people are walking around with an exaggerated mental representation of what other Americans stand for. Where do these ideas come from? Again, reading from The Atlantic. Partisan media outlets have an incentive to stoke their audience's outrage by making extreme views seem commonplace. In our work, we saw that the more people reported consuming partisan news, a category which, drawing on the work of other researchers, we included things such as Fox News and MSNBC. That's parenthetical. The more they believed in a characterized version of the other side. People's perceptions of others are powerful, even when they're wrong. We found that people dislike their opponent primarily for the fringe views most opponents don't actually hold. Worse still, partisans who dislike their opponents most were least willing to engage with them, which likely forecloses the chance to have their misconceptions corrected through real-life personal contact. Instead, an oversimplified, exaggerated version of the other side's view is allowed to live on inside of everyone's head. What's more, partisans told us they were hesitant to voice their opinions about the most extreme positions expressed by people on the same side of the spectrum. For example, liberals were less keen to talk policy publicly about the downsides of censoring free speech than they were to talk about the benefits of universal health care. So although a majority of liberals oppose censorship, their reluctance to criticize it openly might have led to conservatives think the most on the left favor it. So what should politically minded Americans conclude from our research? This is from The Atlantic again. That, gosh, their opponents are just like them and everyone should join hands in the center? Nope. Some policies and some partisans deserve forceful opposition, even contempt from the other side. Vigorous disagreements, both within and between parties, is essential in a functioning democracy. But democracy also requires at least a level of mutual comprehension. No matter where people are on the political spectrum, they ought to know whom they're fighting with and what they're even fighting about. That's Victoria Parker from The Atlantic back a few weeks ago. This gets to the heart of what we actually try to do on this program on Heard Tell. We don't want to just react. We don't want to just pay attention to the noise. It's important to get beyond the outrage and the noise, because if you're reacting, you're not actually doing anything. You're letting the other side or the other person or what you're consuming dictate to you how you act. You need to stay ahead of the news. You need to understand the news, and you start by turning down the noise. Turning down the noise often means not just buying into a caricature. One thing that nationalized news media does, and we've been talking about this at length with the decline of local media, everything has to fit into a national narrative, and that doesn't work in a giant, pluralistic, 330 million strong, super diverse country like America. You end up getting out a really broad brush constantly for everybody because you have to try to fit it into a national narrative. You got to fit it into 3 and 5 minute segments. You got to fit it into 1 or 2 tweets or an Instagram story or a Facebook post. It just doesn't work. There's too many people. They're too varied. They have too many opinions. And many people, just because they are of one party or the other, or one ideology or the other, they're still not monoliths. They may have places where they have disagreements with their own sides and their own parties on certain specific issues. Broad brushing everything in the national media has caused a lot of this problem. So we feed into narratives of one side versus the other because it simplifies it. It makes it easier to understand, makes it easier to consume, and it makes it easier to keep people upset, because once it's our side versus their side, the actual points of it don't matter so much as just making sure you win. That's okay, I guess, but maybe you should make sure that you know what you're actually fighting about. What some of this research has shown, and Pew's had similar data over the years, and we see it again and again and again on topics, if you just turn down the noise and get below the surface a little bit, is folks are fighting about something that they may not even need to fight about at all if they would just calm down a little bit and actually hear what the other side is saying. Sometimes it's just a nomenclature problem. For example, if we take something like criminal justice reform, if we say, well, we want to have bail reform. Well, one side just immediately starts thinking everybody wants to just turn criminals loose on the streets. Well, that's not necessarily true, but if you came at it with a certain nomenclature that a conservative minded person was, hey, the bail system is part of government overreach, and we want to have effective and limited and accountable government, and bail reform is an extension of having accountable government. Now you got an inroad with them, and it makes sense to them in their worldview. And you're not just painting a broad brush, you're actually getting to something they can agree on. I've often said, and people kind of recoil at this, but our environmentalist friends who want to take care of the environment have natural allies in hunters. If they would just quit calling them dumb rednecks with guns and understand that those are people who have a vested interest in conservation and stewardship of nature. You just have to turn down your prior a little bit, get past it, and not broad brush people. There's things like this that we could find a lot of common ground on if we just work on it a little bit. But it all starts every time with making sure we're operating off correct information and not just reacting all the time. If you're just reacting, you're missing out. If you're just reacting, you're being controlled. There's an old saying, don't make an enemy by accident. We're making lots of enemies online in our social and cultural and political commentary just to please the crowds. That's even dumber. We should really stop doing that. More Herd Tell right after this. All right, thrilled to have Cooper Conway with us, another Young Voices contributor, friend of ours, Boise State student, bon vivant of the world, Red Sox fan. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you with us. Suffering through a whole bunch of things between my bad voice and my family issues in the home, making lots of noise that we won't get into. You've been writing about somebody who's highly controversial, though. I have very strong opinions about this guy. I have very mixed opinions about this guy. But let me just open the floor to you this way, and you do it. Elon Musk, rich man, innovator. Some people love him. A lot of people don't. What's your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I gotta admit, he's all of the above. He's a mixed bag. I think I don't want to say I'm an Elon Musk fanboy, but I will say that I appreciate what he's doing for my generation and for future generations and what he's trying to accomplish. So in that case, I'll give him a gold star. Some of his tweets I can disagree with and how he carries himself in public life, but that's really up to him personally. So I'd say I'm a fan. I'd say I support him.
Here's my thing. I've broke this down before. I'll bring it to you this way. I love the SpaceX stuff. I'm highly skeptical of the Tesla stuff, which that's a whole nother thing for its own day. I really can't stand how he publicly carries himself with certain things. Let's talk about the cave rescue and that sort of thing. But I also think there's a place in society for the crazy, eccentric, genius type person. Society needs those kind of colorful characters in a lot of ways. Am I wrong to kind of balance it out that way, or is that kind of how you see him as well?
I see in a similar way. I think how he carries himself is up to interpretation, depending on very much the values that you hold dear. For myself, there's definitely times where I'm not a huge fan, but also some of his outside of the box thinking, I think, is special, and it's obviously unique to him. He's a unique person, and how he carries himself and what his dreams are. And I think we are lacking right now a place where we can support people that dream and think outside of the box. And I think he does that. And so I think that's a good thing.
Is it just the billionaire thing? You were writing about it in this piece that was published at the American Spectator about Elon Musk. Is it the billionaire thing because billionaire has become such a term and buzzword that just anything that's a billionaire is obviously bad? So even though, and again, I've got plenty of problems with how he conducts himself personally and some other issues as well, I don't think this just blanket hatred for everything that's a billionaire is particularly healthy. And that's something you touched on that you think some of the Musk stuff is as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a serious problem. I particularly think that you're right. We just throw this person has this much amount of money in their bank account and they must be bad. And I particularly don't understand it when it comes to Musk, because I think Musk is the one billionaire that my generation in particular should like the most. He's the one that's trying to fight climate change, and he's going to space. He's trying to get us on Mars, and I get worried when he gets named the Time Magazine's 2021 Person of the Year, and people my age are supporting these senators that are going after him for not paying his fair share of taxes, whatever that may be in your mind, or just think that he's an overall bad guy, when I'm seeing his accomplishments over the past year as exciting. And I personally love space. I love the idea of one day us being able to go to Mars and do commercial space travel. And I think we're thinking very much short term, in that he's taking joy rides and not helping the people out on Earth, when I think these joy rides are going to transform into something much bigger decades down the line.
Yeah, see, that's something that our friend Michael Siegel keeps talking about, pushing back on the billionaires in space thing. Is he's like, hey, wait a minute. He's like, you need that because this is how you gateway this stuff. And you talked about that in your piece, that, yeah, you can just bash it, but if you don't have people opening gateways to things like this, yes, they could maybe use it for selfish ends in the end, but somebody's got to do that. And in the current situation we have, in the current environment we have, this is the way this is going to get done.
Completely. NASA recently released a kind of a report and said that these commercial launch services, they're called, such as Elon SpaceX, has lowered the cost of reaching low Earth orbit by a factor of 20. And that's a great innovation that he has provided, and that others like Jeff Bezos have really been making serious step towards helping us get into space and to be able to take advantage of whatever. It's space. We don't really know a whole bunch about it. Whatever advantages we can take from it, we should.
Yeah, talking to Cooper Conway about Elon Musk. Why do you think this is a generation thing? You nailed your piece towards Gen Z. That's not my generation. I'm either the I don't know, the oldest X or the youngest millennial, depending on which metric you want to use there. Why do you point this towards Generation Z as something that's a generational shift of how people view things like Elon Musk?
I think Elon Musk in particular is because, going back to the billionaire point, is that my generation seems to hold these views of capitalism as an evil. Now it's about 50-50% on whether someone from my generation is going to say capitalism is a good or a bad thing. And this goes for even young Republicans. The party that's supposedly supposed to promote free markets has gone down from to only about 66% of Republicans and GOP leaners my age think that capitalism is a good thing. And I think that we're seeing is a problem as, well, he's wealthy and I'm not, and so we're coveting, to make it biblical, not necessarily a good thing. And so he's being attacked for that, instead of saying, well, some of his innovations that has made him all of this money is going to end up trickling down, if you put that in quotation marks, to my generation in terms of innovation.
Talking to Cooper Conway. The thing about it is this is beyond just the traditional left-right spectrum. You talk about this in the piece too, is, not to get into too much horseshoe theory here, but this enviousness of wealth, this covetousness, if you want to use that biblical term again, like you alluded to, both sides tend to go that way once you start talking ideology wise, and especially on society thing and economic things. That's just kind of a part of human nature here, and it doesn't really fit neatly into our ideological spectrum. And then you have somebody like an Elon Musk show up, it makes it even messier, doesn't it?
It really does. My former boss at AEI, James Pathakoukas, described Elon Musk's politics as a politics of progress, and something that isn't really shown on either side of the aisle, in terms of more Republicans are starting not to be super comfortable with free trade. Obviously, Bernie Sanders wanting to kind of redistribute wealth across the board here, and having someone like Elon Musk that really thinks of technology as a way to help solve some of our problems, and embracing that instead of trying to push away from the idea of innovation and growth, really stands out from the pack.
Talking to Cooper Conway about Elon Musk and technology. Let's take it this direction for just a second. We're talking generation gaps, not to go old guy yelling at clouds for a second, but the fact that Musk is kind of immature in his social media presence. He is abrasive. He does act childish a lot of the times. That's something that turns a lot of people off, turns me off. is that generational too, or is that something that maybe the younger generation or Gen Z, maybe it's just something where they just view it differently?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that really depends on if you're, there's definitely people my age who I can think of in my friend group that are Elon Musk fanboys. They love everything he does, whether that's calling Senator Elizabeth Warren Senator Karen and kind of making an attack on her on Twitter, um, or just kind of like we were alluding to, some more immature comments. But also that does turn off a lot of people in my generation. So it kind of just is split down the middle in terms of if you like the guy and his personality at all. I personally have my issues as well. But I think I just need to look past that and look at the idea that Tesla alone in 2020 helped the world avoid 5 million metric tons of CO2 emissions. That's an accomplishment that, despite his bad tweets that I may not agree with, I think is something that's more important.
Yeah, we're talking to Cooper Conway, another of the great Young Voices contributors we get to work with. We're going to take a quick break on Heard Tell. When we come back, going to dig a little bit more into Elon Musk, going to talk a little education with him as well. Kind of talk about, since he's into a space, maybe we're not using education to stare at the stars quite as much as we used to be. We'll get into that with Cooper Conway right after this. And we're back with Cooper Conway, another Young Voices contributor, Boise State. That's the blue field for those of you that sports ball. Cooper, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing fantastic. Hope Boise State is able to get into a bowl game next year, but we'll see.
Didn't they do a bowl on that field one time, and like all the birds killed themselves because they were repainting the lines and there was no white, and all the birds started dive bombing straight into the field because they thought it was water or something crazy? Am I remembering that correct?
That is exactly correct. We don't always like to talk about that as our field killing birds, but yes, that did happen.
Well, on to other matters. One thing we were talking about Elon Musk. You're kind of bailiwick on commentating. We've had you on the show before talking about educational issues. I wonder sometimes, we used to really praise inventors, even excedrin, that's a headache thing, eccentric ones and crazy ones and ones that aren't maybe socially acceptable, but we used to praise them as part of our education system of like, hey, you should aspire to be an Edison or an inventor or a Washington Carver or any of these guys. We don't do that with Musk. Obviously, he turns a lot of people off. He turns me off. I'm upfront about that. But are we losing a link between education and practical inspiration of people by not putting up people that innovate like this as something to be celebrated?
Yeah, I think it's a real problem of what are we valuing? And it seems that creativity is not one of those things that we are valuing in our K through 12 education system. And I think not many people know this, but Elon Musk actually opened up his own private school for some of his children and then also some of his employees at SpaceX, I believe, called Ad Astra, that specifically kind of targets this and goes away from the traditional education model, the pep rallies, the sports, and really does it more towards chemistry labs. And who knows, maybe he has some of the kids play around with some of those flamethrowers just to try something new and think outside of the box.
Just for the record, we are not advocating children play with flamethrowers. Just to put that out there. What should we be focusing on K through 12? Because I've been contending, a lot of people other do. Crisis reveals things. I think COVID has revealed a lot of issues with the K through 12 system, and I don't think they're COVID related. I think they've been revealed by COVID. We were 2 years into this. We've gotten most of the schools back open. Obviously, Omicron's kind of threatening that now. Have we learned anything, or is it just plow ahead as it was before? Because we had a lot of parent outrage, we had a lot of teacher outrage, we had a lot of administrative outrage, but I don't really see anything being different even after all that. Do you?
Yes, I think I see a lot of people who are pointing to the past 2 years and saying our K through 12 system has totally collapsed and has failed our students. And I see it as it's been failing our students. This is not anything new. Students need more opportunities and more choice to attend a school that necessarily works best for them. I'm not saying that all public schools are failing every single child that they serve, but I'm saying that not every child is going to be served by a traditional one-size-fits-all model. And I think when it comes to curriculum, a lot of parents are looking for more transparency in terms of what their child is being taught. And over the past, I would say, year or so, particularly, it's kind of been peeled back and parents are starting to see, oh, this is what my child is being taught. And they're not necessarily liking it. And so they're trying to get something different out of the school system, and the schools aren't exactly budging.
This is something, not to bring it back to Musk again, but people are complaining like, well, why don't they spend this money on planet Earth? Why are they spending all this money on it? Well, education is one of those things we can point to and go, we're spending all the money, that God has on this stuff, and it's not making it any better. But we don't ever seem to put those two arguments together and go like, well, wait a minute, there's a lesson to learn here, but everybody's just talking past it. Do you see that though? That like this is incongruent that we're talking about, we'll spend more money. Well, education is one of those things where spending money alone isn't getting it done. So that argument doesn't really wash with me. Where does it with you?
I completely agree. My friend and fellow Young Voices contributor, Gary Franklin, and I wrote an article recently on Baltimore City's public education system. And we actually pointed towards Musk, and everyone was saying we need to tax him more. And I was saying you could throw every single penny of Elon Musk dollars into the Baltimore City education system, and I would be willing to bet that there's no increase in terms of student achievement. And I think that's because the system itself is broken. The dollars aren't actually reaching the students, and the students aren't seeing that in their lives. The dollars are instead spent on administrative staff or just other terms of funding that isn't necessarily helpful for students being able to achieve.
Yeah. And one thing I've found interesting doing some media stuff is things like school choice really don't cut along the normal ideological lines. I know down in our way a little bit, you have some really super progressive people on things like the environment, but they got interested in school choice because of COVID. You have some people that are really against school choice, but they're very, very conservative in a lot of their other ways. This is one of those issues when it comes to education. You start talking people's kids. I think we try to put ideological and political labels on this stuff, but when you start talking people's kids, I don't think it fits into that conversation nice and neatly. Is that something we haven't done a real good job talking here? Is we just need to understand that when we're talking education, this is a whole different conversation that we maybe need to change our terminology and buzzwords on just a little bit?
I think that's fair, but I also would like to point out, I mean, school choice is wildly, like you were saying, it is wildly popular across the board. There definitely are some people on the right, you could say, that aren't exactly huge fans, and some of those on the left that are more progressive. But generally, we're seeing, I know education savings accounts, for example, among parents have 84% support, which is just wildly high levels. And it is something that, in terms of progressives particularly like it, because you're saying, okay, we're going to give usually lower income families dollars directly so that they can serve, and they can attend these private schools that have been in many ways been consistently outperforming some of these more local government schools that these children have been zoned to. And vice versa, you're definitely getting some types of protectionism from wealthier families who don't want their schools to potentially get hurt by these lower income families. They just like them the way they are. They don't want to change them at all. But really, I think school choice is something where we should be providing opportunities for every single child, no matter the background.
Yep. And to loop this back to Elon Musk, we talk about him being this kind of renegade, eccentric genius. He went to the University of Pennsylvania, alma mater of our former President Trump, by the way. Take that for what that's worth. That is an Ivy League school. I really wonder, one thing I wonder about our education system, though, is when we get somebody who is an outside of the box thinker like this, I don't know that the funnel system of K through 12 education, which is so dependent on get everybody possible into the college and higher education system as quickly as possible. I really wonder we're leaving kids behind that need a different path. And I think we're seeing some things like, they're starting to teach coding. They're starting to teach, online skills. There's been a cry for jobs programs to come back into schools, hybrid learning, where a lot of kids can go to high school and go to community college at the same time. Do you see that trend continuing? Because I wonder, with people like Musk, shouldn't we use that model and be like, hey, we need more people like this, so we better have a wider brush with our education system to give them opportunities to grow and come out of this system?
Yeah, I completely agree. The more diversity that we can bring into the education sphere so that every child has a chance to develop their skills is important. But I also fear we're already seeing in New York, for example, advanced or accelerated learning programs that would serve children like an Elon Musk, who's just naturally and talented and gifted. They aren't getting the chances to go take those higher level math classes because parents are nervous about equity and saying, well, certain kids are getting ahead of my child, and that's not fair. And so they have to, instead of trying to improve their child, hire gifted children are basically being brought down to a certain level, and we're not developing their gifts.
Yeah, I think when it comes to education, if you're one of those people like us that want to advocate for freedom and liberty, I think it needs to be more all of the above than, pick one or two, and like a lot of things in life. Cooper Conway, great talk on this sort of thing. Let folks know where you're at, where they can find you on social media, and what you got coming up, my friend, once you get done with your little break you're taking there.
Yeah, you can follow me at Cooper Conway 1 on Twitter, and then you can see my face on the Young Voices profile page on the web.
Yep, he's a C, I'm an A. He's the line right below mine on the Young Voices page. Cooper Conway, we'll keep having you back, as education is probably going to be a big issue. Election year, so we're going to be talking education, no doubt. You do well, my friend. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. Hope you feel better.
Thank you. I heard tell. Welcome back. I'm Andrew Donaldson. Thank you for staying with us. We like to update stories as we go. We have our friend Michael Siegel on this program frequently. He's a scientist, an astrophysicist, an astronomer, does all kinds of this fancy space stuff, along with talking about other topics of the day when he's on the program. But he was on the program recently, talked about the James Webb Space Telescope. Well, we have an updated story from the Washington Post. NASA's revolutionary James Webb Space Telescope has transformed itself into what looks like a giant kite, successfully deploying a tennis court-sized sun shield designed to keep it operating at extremely cold temperatures. This was the most nerve-wracking phase of the $10 billion mission so far, one flagged repeatedly by officials who had reviewed plans for the telescope and wondered if such a novel design could reliably work. The telescope launched Christmas morning from French Guiana atop an Ariane 5 rocket. The telescope, including the sun shield and all other hardware, was folded up inside the cone of the rocket. It has since had to unfurl itself while hurtling through space. Engineers tested the sun shield on the ground but could not duplicate the conditions in space. The effort to unfurl and then tighten the 5-layer, 70-foot wide sun shield, which NASA describes as providing protection against solar radiation equivalent to SPF 1 million, Lord, took several days, with commands sent from operation centers at the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore. The deployment concluded midday Tuesday with tensioning of the fifth and final layer, a process involving mechanical release devices that account for more than half of the 344 potential single-point failures on this complex mission. It's a unique design, never tried before, never been built before, never been successfully deployed in orbit. John Durning, the deputy project manager for the Webb mission, told the Washington Post on Tuesday. The mission has had a couple of hiccups. At one point, NASA project managers put deployment on pause to analyze readings from the solar array, that they were somewhat different from what they had expected, and made technical adjustments. Durning said it is important to avoid overtaxing the team, which is working 12-hour shifts that sometimes have to be extended. All the major deployments to date, including the solar arrays needed to power the observer array, have gone splendidly. I am thrilled. I have been on the job 15 years. To see it unfurl in space is awe-inspiring, he said in a text of a postscript. 15 years of anticipation of this moment, and it did not disappoint. So, updating our story from our friend Michael Siegel. We'll ask him again when he's on next time. It was very interesting. Michael talked about how they actually developed this technology for unfolding this array. NASA literally took a room, got some engineers, they took a plain old bed sheet, went in the room, and they just folded it over and over and over again, and analyzed it and studied it and did all kinds of mathematical calculations based on how they folded and unfolded it, trying to find the most efficient way to unfold something. Some very old school tech for the highest of high tech that we now have out in space, looking deep into the cosmos, trying to tell us more about our universe. And as Michael explained it, this is almost like looking backwards in time, the way it's looking into how the universe was made and created and the energies involved. Amazing piece of science. And those engineers started out with a bed sheet, trying to figure out how to fold it, just like you did with your mom, or if some of us that were in the military trying to get those perfect hospital corners back in basic training. Interesting how things work out. Nice little piece of science and tech news. More Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell Show. You know, we always try to end our program on a happier note or a lighter note, especially when we're covering such heavy topics. Another story following up on, remember we talked about the I-95 snowpocalypse and the 24 hours or longer some folks had to get stuck on I-95 up in the Virginia area. There was some good news in that, reading from NBC4 out of Washington, D.C. It had almost been 21 hours. A Maryland couple was among the many people stranded overnight on Interstate 95 in Virginia, tired, cold, and hungry. When 23-year-old Casey Node noticed a bread truck among the stopped vehicles, she decided to reach out to the company, Schmidt Baking Company, to see if the food inside could be shared. Within 20 minutes, she said the CEO himself called her, told her to hand her phone to the truck driver, and told the driver to release the bread to anyone who needed it. That was one of the kindest moments I'd ever witnessed, Noe wrote on a Facebook post that had since gone viral. In an interview with NBC News, Noe said that her and her husband, John Noe, 24, have been traveling from Ellicott City, Maryland to North Carolina to visit family. Her husband is a senior airman in the Air Force, and the couple wanted to see their family before moving to Germany next week. The Noes ended up stuck at mile marker 148, which was 10 to 15 miles from the crash that involved 6 tractor trailers. Quote, after almost 21 hours of being stuck on I-95, sleeping here overnight, not having access to food or water, and all the nearest towns being out of power, we were tired, frustrated, and hungry, Casey Noe recounted on Facebook. Many of the people stuck out here had small children, were elderly, had pets in their cars, and hadn't eaten in almost a whole day. Casey and John Noe flagged down the bread truck driver, Ron Hill. His truck was stranded with them, but he was stocked with loaves of bread. Hill works for the Schmidt Baking Company, and Casey reached out to the CEO. She says the CEO then called her directly, told her to hand the phone over to Hill and release the bread, which they passed out to nearly 50 different cars. A little bit of friends taking care of friends and people making neighbors of whoever's around them. Touching story in a tough, difficult situation. Good on them, good on the Schmidt Baking Company. That'll do it for Heard Tell today. Thank you so much. The response on the last couple of shows have been tremendous. We really appreciate it. If you leave a comment on any of the various platforms that you watch the show on, whether it's YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, wherever, we will try to reply to you, get you an answer. We love interacting with you. You want to talk to us directly at Heard Tell Show at the Twitter, or heardtellshow@gmail.com. You can send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. Keep your bearing, be nice. Might even put it on the show and talk back to you a little bit. In the meantime, wherever you and yours are, we sure appreciate you listening. We hope we find you and yours well. We hope you're well fed. Till we talk to you tomorrow. That's it for Heard Tell. Y'all take care.
All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.